right, welcome back, listeners, to Agile Disrupted, a podcast for the people in the trenches of Agile, where voices are heard and stories are shared. To start, you have your host, Tabby, which is me. We have MC.
Hello, hello.
Hi, MC. And we got a comeback speaker from a previous episode, John Augustine, founder of AgileBurn.com. Thanks for joining us, John.
Hey, happy to be here. Round two,
fight. So today's lovely episode is going to be called Agile Interviews. Enough said. So I want to ask all of you that's listening to this episode today, John and MC. So as I run through this synopsis here. So what is your workday like? Honestly, like, is your work that you do each day meaningful, or is it like sucking the life out of you? Have you become complacent, unmotivated? Do you feel underutilized? Do you feel underappreciated? If so, I mean, was it always like this? No, of course not. Like, your first day at any organization is the glorious day of where your inner battery of hope and excitement and curiosity is at full capacity. Because everything is new and exciting, and you're about to begin a new era full of possibilities. But does the organization feel that way too, though? Does your hiring manager share the same sentiment, that the future is bright and full of possibilities? Or were you hired as a temporary gap to basically fill in? You know what I mean? So when an organization envisions a future that's full of hope, so does the people, and the people they hire to bring along with them. But are most organizations looking into the future or obsessing over the present? Are organizations treating people as resources or beacons for a better tomorrow? So what do you think, John? Which one do you think it is? Are organizations obsessing over what's going on in the present, or are they thinking about the future?
I think it's both. I think there's always that natural dynamic, that kind of tug of war between trying to build stability versus trying to move forward in the organization or kind of advance to the next level. And there's some people in that organization or organizations that, are kind of grounded in either of those kinds of, perspectives. But I think, joining an organization or, going through the interview process or looking through job descriptions, and that's kind of like a process where you kind of try to figure out which way that organization is leading at that given moment for that particular role. Mm-hmm. So I think about like the last two places that I've joined, I guess, or was hired at. Like, I think in both of those instances, I joined companies that seemed like they had promise. Like they exemplified hope and the aspiration to try new things. So I guess in those situations, I felt like they were focusing more on the future, at least during the interview process and I guess the onboarding process.
Yeah, and don't you sometimes like look at, I guess, role requisitions and just you read through them and it's like you can see the flags. Like, you can clearly see the flags if this organization is optimistic or pessimistic. And that's kind of disheartening too, don't you think? Like, you read through the rec description and it says one thing for the role, but it doesn't match what the role is intended for in the actual description. I'll see, like, a fairly common one is for Scrum Masters. And Scrum Masters and project managers, it almost seems like they're intertwined. Like, it's like they're the same person almost. Or some requisitions will say Scrum Master / project manager or Agile Scrum Master. Like, what's the alternative? Like, a Scrum Master that's not Agile? Like, I don't understand.
Yeah. It's funny. I wrote down some of my notes here. Like, so I got a rec the other day for a large company in Charlotte, and It says the title, Project Manager 3, and in parentheses, IT Scrum Master.
What does that mean?
What does that mean, right? And then, and it's just bizarre because like I've got some significant gripes on the recruiting side of things where like I think a lot of recruiters don't know the industry and they're like leading Agilists down the wrong path, or they're just lazy. You know what I mean? And it's just, there's these odd things of just like unprofessionalism and laziness where like the top of your email shouldn't say this is not spam, because that raises a red flag right away.
Thanks for that clarification email.
Right? So looking at that posting, right, it said things like manages projects. And one thing that I think a lot of people might differ over, like it said facilitates the sizing of stories during planning sprint, backlog grooming, or sprint planning sessions. I'm like, what is planning sprint versus sprint planning session?
And what the hell?
But at the same time, like backlog grooming's not for me. So I see other recs where it says, runs the backlog grooming session. Like, that's not for me. That's for the product owner. So they know what the hell to put in their backlog. So, or like, manages the budgets, or the standard develops and maintains a productive relationship with insert business title here. And it's like, are you guys just copy pasting this stuff? Like,
they totally are.
When I read that, I'm like, you don't want a Scrum Master or an Agilist, or you don't want a change agent, right? To use the terrible buzzword. You want a project manager who's going to run ceremonies. That's what it reads like. And when I see those, I'm like, nah, I'm good. Like, even if I'm looking, I'm like, nope, not for me, because I'm gonna get bored there and leave after 3 or 4 months.
Yeah, and it's like they like put a rec together like it's Frankenstein. Like, we're gonna put a little bit of this rec in here. We're gonna put a little bit of agile coaching in here, a little bit of project manager. Oh, and let's just throw in product owner. Let's just make it like a Frankenstein version of a role. But I interrupted you, John. Go ahead.
Well, yeah, I don't think. I mean, I think to your original point or question, Tabby, I don't think that's really an example of pessimism on the organization side, because I think MC's point, that situation is to me an example of laziness. Where that recruiter didn't have a good conversation about what these roles are in order to really try to attract a particular kind of person. And also, it's maybe an example of like a hiring manager who's saying, oh, well, if I'm going to get a Scrum Master, let's throw a little project manager on top of that. Sprinkle a little BA, maybe. Try to get that jack of all trades, which ultimately creates a person who has conflict maybe once they show up, because they they have multiple purposes. But I think all that creates pessimism. I think for people who are looking for like a good true Scrum Master role, when they see these kinds of things, it's kind of discouraging, because maybe you'd be interested in the organization, and then you read that job description and then you're like, ugh, well, maybe they don't really know if they want a person like me. So I think it kind of bums you out a little bit.
If I see manages budget, I'm out. Like, that's a immediate, no, I'm good.
Yep.
Like,
exactly.
On the lazy front today. So this happened today, where I got a rec, and I read through the description, and like the first line, I'm like, did someone just send me a rec for the company that I'm currently working for? So, like, to me, that was like a lean in moment. Like, I leaned in. I was like, oh, what is this? Is there another company here that does this? So then I start reading it, and I was like, you know what? I'm not going to ignore this. So I replied. I was like, hey, who's this? This sounds really... Yeah, I was like, what's the company? This sounds really interesting. And he said it, and I was like, oh, yeah, I'm still here, and I'm going to be here for the foreseeable future.
My God.
The response back was, oh, ... your profile in my system must be outdated. And I'm like, why didn't you look at LinkedIn before cold emailing me? Like,
why are you looking at an old profile? Do your due diligence, man. Like, okay, so you touched on something, John, where like maybe the recruiter is misrepresenting the company on a pessimistic front. Are we assuming that most requisitions are being posted just by the recruiter, or is it a copy and paste from the organization? How do we know?
I don't think we know, but I don't know. Yeah. The more and more I kind of look into job descriptions and talk to recruiters here and there, the more and more I feel they're the middleman, in the sense that they're trying to please the client, and so maybe the client comes up with a job description based on their understanding of the role, and at what point does the recruiter say, sorry, you got it wrong, client? There's going to be some kind of diplomacy there. So I don't know. My gut feels it's more of like, don't shoot the messenger situation.
But I think you bring up a really good point, John, around being the middleman and understanding that, hey, company, you've got it wrong, right? Because I've worked with a handful of recruiters where I like greatly respect the approach that they take, because they don't send me a job description. They send me, hey, I'm looking to fill this type of a role at this type of a company. And when I speak to the hiring manager, it sounds like they're really looking for an individual who has these types of traits and could come in and work with 2 or 3 teams and do these types of things. And it's like conversational. And then when you bite on that lead, then they send you the job description and say, let's set up a call and talk. And I think those are the types of people who are doing 2 things. They're they're going through the effort to understand the industry and be able to translate like bad HR, not bad, outdated HR speak into what like we need to see in the market today. And then they put forth the effort to portray the role for what it really is, and not what the posting says. Because for every recruiter that I've talked to, they're like, yeah, I have breakfast with the hiring manager, once a month to get a good understanding of how the wheels are really turning. And those are the type of folks where I will like go out of my way to work with them because I'll ask, so when you spoke with the hiring manager, what's the culture like? How's it evolved? Something that you're never going to see in a posting. And you can tell when they're like bullshitting their way through that answer and give you, kind of a BS statement. I'm like, cool, you're not engaged. You're just trying to get a warm body and make your little 30% off the top.
Exactly. And it's so hard. Like, let's just be real here. It is so hard to find a good recruiter. As much as it is as hard it is to find a good agile professional, like a good product owner or a good scrum master. And what does good really mean, right? Good may be subjective to the eye of the beholder. But I think what I've noticed over a few trends with organizations is that they may be going through painful transformations. And I like to call them fragile transformations versus agile transformations. And when they're going through that immediately like seeps into the job description. You can see that from like a mile away. So does that mean the organization is pessimistic, or they're just in a temporary painful period in their journey of their agile transformation, and they're just looking for help? Like they're just like waving a white flag, like they're trying to get people to come like help them out in this painful transformation. But again, that brings me back to the same point. Like, are we being optimistic about the future, or are we just filling in gaps? Are we treating people like resources?
Then just say it. Just say we're going through a troublesome agile transformation and we need a strong individual to come in and help guide the ship. I'm pretty like what's the old Southern phrase? You can catch more bees with honey than vinegar. Like, don't give me this watered down shit. Like, give me the real, and then you're gonna get the right people. Like, I don't know about you guys. I tell you both all the time. Like, I'm transparent to a fault. It gets me in trouble all the time, but I think it brings me a whole lot more positivity in my life. Not just my, professional, my personal life as well. And that's just the approach. Like, just tell me, like, we've been going through an agile transformation and it's been stagnant for 5 years. And we need someone to come in here and rock the boat and do X, Y, Z. Like, just be upfront and just tell me what it is that you're really looking for. Like, why it's almost like you're interviewing the company through the rec to find out if they're a fit for you. Then you got to interview the company in person while they're also trying to interview you. And it's like, why are we interviewing each other 3 times here? Like, just put it up, put your cards on the table, let's have a conversation.
Yeah, and that speaks volumes of an organization based on their transparency in that job description. Like, I immediately trust that organization already because they have laid out what their current situation is, and they are making an investment of what kind of people they're looking out for, because they want to establish that transparency from the very beginning. And that also brings me to the point of, like, when are there times where the hiring manager like is obviously trying to fill in a gap and they have no interest in, like, into the future. They are so bogged down and, like, I guess, so lost in their paradigm of problems that they're just looking for a specific kind of person, a specific kind of scrum master that's going to play project manager and check all these boxes, but they're not looking for talent retention at all. Like, they're not looking that far ahead into the future because maybe the organization's pessimism has jaded their ability to look into the future. So that's also another factor too. But what do you think, John? You look like you're deep in thought.
Well, I mean, there are instances where you just need somebody, like if, somebody leaves the organization and you have to fill that space because, there are things in motion. And, when I think about like certain agile frameworks, when I think about like the big scaling framework, to me, that's a very structured, execution-focused framework. Mm-hmm. And, if somebody leaves, you're in the middle of executing on an increment, you're going to want somebody to kind of fill that gap and keep the ball rolling. So sometimes, I think organizations just they almost have to forget about the future and just deal with the now, which is fair. Mm-hmm. But I think to MC's point, be transparent. Be transparent about that. Say, hey, right now, we have to solve for X and Y, but later on, maybe we can kind of work on Z and maybe a couple of your ideas even. But I think that's when I think about job descriptions that have an emphasis on execution. So when I see a lot of words like budget or project manager in the job description, I think one of two things. One is, they're kind of stuck maybe in a place where they need something from an execution point of view. Like maybe they're feeling pressure or there's something going on. But also, like when you see those words, it exemplifies where they are in their transformation. So in a way, like when you see those words, it's almost like they're asking for help indirectly.
Yeah.
I guess you have to your point of optimism, you kind of have to hope they're asking for help, saying, here's where we are right now, but help us get out of this, help us Scrum Master by helping us get out of this kind of project mode and move more to a product, value, kind of flow mindset.
I'm glad you bring that up, John, because it actually makes me reflect on some of the stuff I just said a few minutes ago, right? I think I am personally at a place in my career where I'm not interested in the traditional transformation where we're significantly struggling to do X, Y, Z. Like, I've been there, I've got those scars and battle wounds. I'm not trying to fight uphill anymore. I'm trying to get to a place where we're trying to build a new road, right? We've gone through the slog, or if you look at like the Virginia Satir curve, right? Like, we're on the upswing. I'm not interested in the downswing anymore. Been there, done that. So I'm glad you bring that up, John, because I think, and the reason I say that is I think when I take my approach and thought process regarding the job postings that I get, I can see if I put them on a Satir curve, which for those, if you're listening, you're not familiar with that, it's basically, you're here where you're at, and then as you start to curve down, that's where your transformation happens, and over time you're going to curve back up. I think I look for those postings that are starting on the upswing or already up on the upswing, and they're getting ready for their next curve, right? Because it's not, you're not always going to go up, you're going to curve again. But so one thing though, just switch gears here, that I'm super interested in, and I know as we pregame this, you brought this up, Tabby, and when we listened to the Simon Sinek interview with Brian Collins, they talked about culture fit.
Yes.
And how so we've talked a lot about the recruiting side, so let's transition to the interview side of it a little bit, because it's a whole nother dynamic. And I think a lot of places, they like, and I've worked at places like this where it's like culture fit over everything else. And
oh, man.
I think that works when you're still a startup, and I think that works when you've got like 20-30 people, right, which is still kind of a startup. But once you start topping, 3 figures of employees, I think that like pressure and drive towards culture fit creates these cliques within the culture. And I think that has more negative benefits than not. Tabby, I know you've got big thoughts on this.
Oh yeah, big time. So I will share with you all a story. Okay. So I was the underdog growing up. I will always be the underdog deep in my roots. So when an organization is like, let's say they're interviewing me, and they're looking for a specific archetype of a person, and it starts pushing into this metaphor of, oh, we want this binary carbon copy of all the people that we have in this organization. We're not interested in what you're trying to bring. Like, really? Is that really culture fit or culture click? Like, you're not good enough. I'm sorry, said person. Like, you don't fit the bill. Like, we're just gonna play the mean girl card, and like you just go on your way. So I bring that up because that's very disheartening, because when we're hiring people, we're hiring for the future, right? We should be hiring people to bring in a culture contribution, to build this community that is obviously diverse, but also brings insight that we weren't even thought of. And how often does that happen? Like, you come into an interview and you start to see flags, like not the good kind, but the flags of where they're looking for a specific kind of person and they're asking you specific questions so that you answer it a certain way so they can check some boxes in their head if you're a good culture fit. And I mean, again, that's very disheartening, because an organization that's optimistic about the future isn't looking for a specific outcome. So why should they be looking for a specific culture that fits the existing bill when that's ever changing as it is? But I'm going to ask you that question, John. What do you think?
I don't know. Like, culture, I guess, is such a big word. But like, if you just, if I think about like Bob Galen, I think he kind of had a podcast recently where he talked about like the key things that he looks for in an interview. And he mentioned 3 things, but 2 things come to mind, like attitude and aptitude. But like the attitude part to me is like the cultural piece of it, So I mean, like how much can you really gauge about a person personally, or even how much can you gauge about an organization during like an interview that maybe takes 1 hour, if you're lucky, maybe 2. I mean, how deep can you go to really understand if you feel like you're aligned? But attitude on both sides of the fence, I think, can be picked up in those conversations. And to me, that's probably the only thing that defines culture, or the only thing that maybe you could probably define as culture, during that brief exchange. So like an interviewer sits down with somebody and they're just a bummer, and they're looking for somebody to help them grow the organization, and that person's like, my last job sucked or whatever. And maybe that person just had a bad day, but if they're not expressing some kind of positive attitude, then I think it's fair to say that person doesn't have a cultural fit. But I don't know how much further you can go.
Yeah, and you could see it from both sides too, because you have to interview, like you're being interviewed, but you're also interviewing the company and the organization. And when you think about that, and you think about a future relationship with this hiring manager, let's say, like you're trying to envision your future, isn't it important for hiring managers to teach like new hires to envision their own future for themselves, and to have them build a confidence about that same future? Because otherwise they might feel like they're hired to do a specific task and they are limiting themselves. Like that's all they're hired to do. Like why would they invest into a growth mindset if that wasn't even expected of them?
And I think we're not in a role to be stagnant forever. You know what I
No,
mean?
not at all.
And I think that's where, especially when you're doing like contractor, contingent worker type stuff, I think that's where the industry really needs to change. And it might not just be for Agilists and Scrum Masters. It might just be for every role.
Everyone.
You gotta build your people in one way, shape, or form. Whether they're consultants or contingent workers or FTEs. So I think that's a really big part as well. And on the culture fit side of stuff, I know one of the really cool things that Brian Collins alluded to in the conversation he had with Simon Sinek was, it's not just are they a culture fit, but it's also like the input that they can bring to the culture. So I think when we evaluate culture fits, I think what winds up happening is we look for, the same type of person that's already there. But I think like the challenging side of that is, okay, what is this person's mindset? If we can assess it somehow in this meeting, what does that bring to the community? Will that jive with the community? Will they challenge some people in the community? Like I know, obviously, we all work together and I've interviewed people, and you both were not a part of the interview process, and you both crossed my mind at certain points as I'm talking to these candidates and say, how would this person jive with Tabby? Like I'm noticing some XYZ about a personality.
You're putting me
here.
into this scenario. That's not a good outcome, man. Like you just don't know.
How fast is Tabby gonna rub this person the wrong way with her bubbly personality?
Thanks, MC. I really appreciate that.
but even on the flip side, right, for John, right? I know John, you have a very intellectual mindset of how you approach things, and I'm like, okay, would John challenge this person? Based on their demeanor in this conversation, if they challenge, how's that going to come across? And I think all this leads me back to my, I don't know even what to call it, but it's my favorite question I asked during interviews. And I don't know if you guys know this or not, but when we interviewed someone a few months ago, I made them cry with this question.
Okay. You made someone cry. Good work, MC.
Yeah, that was great.
Like real legacy right there.
But it's for me, this is my culture question, right? If you could spend one day with any person, dead or alive, who would it be and why? And I'm looking for a lot of interesting things in this conversation. I'm looking for, are you going to go in and say, I'm going to pick Simon Sinek because he's a phenomenal agile thinker and blah, blah, blah. Like, you're going to just pick like the biggest name, one of the biggest names in our industry?
Yeah, really?
You know what I mean?
Like, be a little original, man.
You're gonna pick Elon Musk, you're going to pick Barack Obama. Like, and if you're picking those names, you better have an amazing reason why.
Seriously.
And that's kind of what I'm looking for.
Right.
I'd pick
like
Larry
Elon
David.
Musk, though? Like...
Larry David's awesome. Imagine that.
But like that's what I want to hear.
I would love to kind of pry into that mind one day.
And when you talk about culture fits, that tells me exactly what I just said a few seconds ago. That you're an intellectual thinker. You think a few surface levels deeper than most people do. And that's a type of character that is needed in a culture, because I know like when we're in conversations, I sometimes turn into the dominant voice in the conversation. And I look to personalities like you, John, to be a little bit more inquisitive and not just dive in heads first, right? I can't always be the bull in the china shop, and you need the other type of thinkers. So when you're having those culture conversations, it's like, it's not just, is everyone like John? Is everyone like Tabby? Is everyone like MC? I need someone that's the complete opposite of John, but maybe they've got the right enough soft skills that they can challenge him in a positive manner too. And I think that's where the culture fit push attempts to go, but I think in many situations it evolves into like a gray blob of employees where everyone looks the exact same.
Exactly. And maybe it should be rebranded, like to culture contribution versus culture fit. But go ahead, John.
So I think the example that MC just gave, like in a way you kind of defined culture through the very act of asking that question. Because like by you asking everybody or thinking about like, how is this person going to challenge others? How is this person going to react? How are they going to react to being challenged? That to me is you saying our culture values the act of challenging each other. And so in a way, you're looking for a culture fit. Right? You're saying, we are challengers, therefore we're looking for a challenger. Are you one of those? Are you one of us?
We want a challenged answer, buddy.
It's a good point. I think though, when we talk about, you brought up earlier, John, about like, are you just trying to fill a gap, right? Sometimes you just need that gap. Other times, again, going all the way back to what you were talking about before, Tabby, are we just resources or are we looking to the future, right? There comes a time, there's an inflection point when you're building an organization where you say, okay, cool. Do I need to hire another XYZ? Or do I need to bring someone in here who's gonna stir some shit because we need it, because we're getting complacent, and it's interesting. I know for me personally, there are times in my career when I feel like I'm getting complacent in a job, and that's when I'm like, all right, cool, it's time to like tighten the belt another notch, and we're about to create a new project for me because I'm getting complacent and I'm getting lazy, right? Just like the recruiters.
Yeah, and I know this is kind of turning into like a Brian Collins fan club, but like, I mean, the man was on point in that episode. Like, we're just kind of giving kudos to him. But a quote that like really hit me hard is when he mentioned that like when the people that he hires become these gladiators and these all-stars and they move on to bigger and better things. Simon Sinek kind of talks about like, how do you feel about that? Like, you hire people and then they become great and then they leave you. And he basically responds with like, the grass isn't necessarily greener on the other side. It's greener where you water it. And I think that's so profound, because I know that when, I guess, interviewees are going into the job market, is that grass going to be watered? Maybe you're not looking for like the perfect golden ticket to like the Willy Wonka factory, but you're hoping as much as they are. Like they're hoping for an optimistic future, but are they actually going to plan for that future? Are they making efforts for that future? And I think that's very important basically in that conversation that you have with your hiring manager. And I'll share with you both a story of mine where this was a learning experience for me. And if I hadn't gone through this, I wouldn't have like be able to see the flags and interviews that I see now. And I went through an interview, and the title was so vague and redundant. It was called consultant. I'm like, the hell does a consultant mean? Like, that could be a giant umbrella for all things in the world. That could be a consultant for Tony Stark for all I know. So like, consultant, and like I looked at the job description and it had some elements like of Scrum Master responsibilities, but I was such a novice that like I just kind of ignored the other flags of the project manager expectations. So fast forward, I nail the interview, I get there, and the office, holy shit, like the office doesn't even match the job description. Like, it's a satellite office, they didn't even mention that, and like the environment is very toxic. Obviously it's a pessimistic organization. You could just tell by the energy. And long story short, I didn't stay there very long, but it made me reflect on what were they thinking in the interview. Obviously they wanted a specific kind of person to complete a specific kind of task, and maybe they hired me as a vessel for tasks. They weren't even treating me like a person. They hired me to just complete a task, not have a full thought process, and contribute to a culture. Because when I joined the office, I'll tell you, I stuck out like a sore thumb, and I didn't understand what their thought process was in bringing me into this organization, because obviously I didn't fit in. I wasn't meeting their needs. I had a full thought process, and I provided complete sentences, so I wasn't just yes man. So I think about that, and it was disheartening on my part, because I kind of felt a little betrayed, because we have one conversation in the interview, and maybe the hiring manager doesn't follow through on the other end. But sometimes you could be in an interview and it could be one perspective of what the organization is, but when you actually start your first day, that's when you really get the truth, and it can be scary sometimes.
So I'm glad you brought up the interview side of it, because I'm interested, or you shared that story. I'm interested in both of y'all's like best, worst interview story that you've. So my favorite interview that I went through made me the most uncomfortable, and uncomfortable to the point I wanted to throw up when I was done. So we met at like we met at like a little two-top table out in like a open area, patio type thing outside of an office building. And when we start going through the questions and we're learning stuff, and he asked me a question. I can't exactly remember what it was. And it was one of those, you ever get asked a question in an interview and you're like, oh, I know this answer.
Oh,
so
yeah, buddy.
I give him that like, yep, I'm prepared for this one. I give him that answer. And he gives me this look, and I can tell his body language was like, huh, okay. And then he asked me another question, and my brain was like, that's the same question, but just different words. And we went through this song and dance 4 or 5 times, and by the final time I answered it, I was like angry. I'm like, I'm giving you the answer, and I know that it's right. I'm not cheating on the test teacher. I actually know this. Why are you asking me the same shit over and over? So I get done with the interview, and I'm like, oh my God, like what did I do to piss this guy off? I like bombed it. And then like the way we separated and went back to our office buildings and stuff, even that felt cold. So then I talked to the handler that was there, and she says, oh my God, Michael, he loved you. He said you did such a great job. And I'm like, are you fucking shitting me? He asked me the same question 5 times. I felt stupid.
And it made you feel obsolete.
Yeah, and I said that, and she laughed, and she says, yeah, he was just trying to rattle you. He wanted to see if you actually knew something, and if you could answer a different question that was the same question, but come to the same conclusion. He wanted to make sure you weren't just like memorizing, the Scrum Master shall XYZ. And I was like, that's cool, but like, tell me that. Like, it's like I hated the interview because I felt so bad, but then I loved it because I was like, oh, okay, I see. Like, and that's when I do my interviews, that's the approach that I try to take. How can I make sure this person's not BSing me? Because I've got an hour, 2 tops. If it's early or if it's later in the process. So, John, what are your thoughts? What is one of your favorite or least favorite like interviews you've gone through?
Well, one of the interviews that comes to mind was actually, to me, it was a good experience. Like, I actually didn't get to round 2, so I must have screwed up in some way. But I just remember the experience, and when I was sitting in there, I knew like within a minute that I was talking to somebody who kind of got my role. So right away, there was kind of like a calm tone to the interview where it didn't feel like formal and stressful or anything like that. It felt very conversational. And then right away as I was kind of talking about, some of my background and some using, I guess, some Agile buzzwords, I could tell this person understood my language. So I felt like that even kind of increased the level of comfort or conversational tone to the, she asked me about my different experiences, like, how would you do this? How would you do that? And there were some points in the conversation where I did stumble and stuff, but, still looking back, I felt like it was just a good experience because I felt like it wasn't, we talk about words. It wasn't a person who was maybe trying to understand the Scrum Master role, or, maybe had, struggling with that curve that you were talking about, MC, where you're trying to figure out, do I want a project manager or Scrum Master kind of thing? Like, this person knew my role in a way that we could quickly get on the same page, so it felt like there was a good vibe. And ultimately, yeah, I guess, like I said, maybe I didn't kind of, make the cut or, or said something stupid, but in a way, I felt it was a good experience because I don't know, it felt like that person, through their experience, and their familiarity with my role, they were prepared to have that conversation with me. Looking back, it felt good.
Nice. Tabby, what you think?
Man, I'm glad I got time to like think about this. Thanks for asking me and like waiting till the last minute. Now I know how this feels. So my last interview experience was quite comical because I actually had to move out of state into the unknown, to a city I've never been to. I don't know anybody. So the interview was this weekend trip that I made, right? And I was just kind of humoring it for the most part. And the interview process was very impressive because I didn't expect the format to be in this speed dating kind of fashion. Like, I was very much challenged, and it really honed in my improv skills. I kind of like tabled for a couple of years, but like it really came back during that interview because you got like 5-10 minutes to like answer these questions, and they just keep coming. So I was very engaged and very excited, oddly, in this interview. Like, I didn't feel like it was a conversation that was just dragging on for like hours and we keep repeating ourselves. I was actually being tested, and I think me as a person, I love being challenged in a conversation. I am all for witty banter. So if you're like challenging me to give a response in 5 seconds, I am all for it. Like, game on. So I particularly liked that interview because it wasn't focused on content. It was it was more focused on thinking on your feet, because isn't that kind of how life is? You get thrown into like some BS and it gets thrown at you, and you just have to think on your feet, but you want to think things through, and it puts you in a challenging spot to have that balance. And this interview was probably like my last one, and I distinctly remember it because I looked like it was a big group, right? And the other people were very, very serious in this interview. Like they had this serious tone and the serious face on, and I'm just like having a ball. Like I was having a good time throughout the entire process. But I definitely liked it, and the format was very good in a way that it kept you engaged versus sitting in a chair for 4 hours trying to like just get through the interview, and just 4 hours talking to a person is just very exhausting. But that's the inner ambivert coming out from my stand. But
Nice,
yes,
I like it.
so I'm gonna ask you both one more question with the content that we have today. So, and this is biased towards us because all three of us are senior agilists. So when you see recs on LinkedIn or like whatever job posting site, typically you look at the rec and then like you immediately like Glassdoor the organization. Like is the rec a little too optimistic, and you just kind of like you fact check them a little bit? Like if the organization at a 2.5 out of 5, like it's not a good sign. So you look at the rec and like they have all these different versions of the Scrum Master. Like the other day I saw this rec for senior associate Scrum Master, and I didn't understand like which one is it? Is it senior Scrum Master or associate Scrum Master? And then that thought process turned into what's the difference? So I'm gonna ask you both, what do you think the difference is between Scrum Master versus Senior Scrum Master versus Agilist versus Senior Agilist with this 4-tier system that's going on?
I think it's years experience, or the expectation around experience. I know for myself, like I kind of label myself as a senior Scrum Master, partly because I don't want to be hit up by recruiters for like junior Scrum Master roles, because it's not going to work out. It's something where it's probably like, if they want somebody who is at a different, I guess lower pay grade or whatever, because they want someone junior, I'm looking for something else. So using the word senior kind of just lessens the noise. And because I'm at that place where I'm looking for like those different kinds of challenges that maybe a junior Scrum Master might be looking for. So for me, using the word senior kind of helps me hone in on a fit quicker. So it's that label to kind of cut the noise.
I think for me, it's arbitrary that there's a difference, because I think at my core, I believe you should be able to do most of the same stuff, whether you're junior or senior. You just may not be as effective at it, right? Or you may need a little helping hand. But I think that's like my belief. But I think when these roles are out there, I tend to view them just like John in a pay perspective. Like that's just obvious, right? It's business. I see. One of the things that if I'm going out for a senior role, which is what I generally look for, one of the things that I'm kind of quizzing the business on is like, at what point in time am I expected or going to be able to impart change on the organization, right? I know for me personally, I absolutely love working with teams. I want to stay working with teams as much as I can, but I want that flexibility to be able to do some organizational stuff, right? I think it kind of goes back to what we were talking about before. Where it's like, oh man, I'm stagnating. Let me create an organizational project and then fall back to my teams for a little while. So that's kind of where I see the difference at when you talk senior. And I don't see a difference between Scrum Master, Agilist, Agile Coach. I think that's all bullshit HR. I think it's all the same damn job. You might be team centric. This person might be executive centric. It's the same damn thing in my eyes. So I just view the senior as kind of like the HR way of saying, like, you're going to have an opportunity to do a little bit more than just work on teams and just facilitate the ceremonies and manage the budget and do all the project manager shit.
I agree. And just, it puts people in a box. It just does. I mean, let's just call it that, okay? Like when you have a tier system for a role, that's it's a dedicated role in the Scrum Guide, people. Like there's no version 1, version 2, version 3. And then like when you get hired as like, oh, you're a senior Scrum Master and you have junior Scrum Masters underneath you, you think they're not going to change? So what happens when they are no longer longer a junior scrum master? Do they have to remain in their actual title when they're actually a senior? Like, that's why the tier system is flawed, because scrum masters grow. Like, any wonderful scrum master out there will have a team. They will grow from that team, and the teams make us grow, because as scrum masters, we are inherently also looking at a future. We're looking at a future of how we can make this team successful, and we already know that future is present and we recognize it. So we're optimistic by nature, and knowing that, it helps us grow as agile professionals too. So I asked that question because I just think it's really flawed. And when we put people in a box, we kind of limit themselves of their actual potential.
I think there's a little spin to that, though. Let me just I guess throw a little
go for it.
Little bit on there. So like, suppose you have an organization that's very contractor based, so they don't think long term. They don't hire people for the long term. They don't hire FTEs. They hire, 1-year contracts, 6-month contracts. So they think, okay, what can I do to get by for the next year? So we kind of talked earlier about like execution, like now worrying about the now versus the future. So right now, they might be looking at a situation where the now requires a person who can deal with a modest amount of like scrum master responsibility. So maybe it's a person who can handle one team, maybe senior scrum masters, they feel like, I can handle multiple teams. I can do that. And plus I can deal with the business. So in that case, I think that job description would be looking for somebody who would be, I guess, considered not a senior scrum master, but a junior scrum master. But that term doesn't really exist. Junior scrum master is really like either you're scrum master or senior scrum master. So if they ask for somebody who's a senior or just a regular scrum master for the short term to fill that gap, I think that's okay, because there's somebody out there right now who is probably sitting in their current day job saying, oh man, I wish I could be a scrum master if I could only get the chance, that first year chance, to kind of, get the calluses that MC was talking about earlier. So those people, they'll embrace the junior scrum master role I think that's okay. So I think in those cases, it's okay to like differentiate senior versus regular scrum master, because I think the circumstances require somebody with maybe a smaller scope, and there's a person out there who wants that smaller scope. They just want to get some basic experience to maybe even know if that's the career path that they want.
I think that's fair. I mean, organizations kind of need to know what they're hiring for. It's just business, right? That's just the nature of the business. You may have a team that has an opening, and you're like, all right, I need like a strategic thinker in here because they need to challenge the product side over here because they're missing the boat. So I need to bring in somebody with the right skill set who maybe they've got product experience, and I need them to come in here, and maybe I need them to do a little more consulting than facilitating. Or hey, I got a team that's like getting ready to go to support. They got about 6 to 8 months left. I just need a body to keep the wheels on.
But to your point, Tabby, eventually that person might like being a scrum master, and the scrum master role by definition is a learning, growing organism. So eventually 1 year from now, they're probably going to say, hey, I want that next level challenge. I want 2 teams. I want to work with the product or the business now. And at that point, if your organization doesn't think ahead in those terms, then that person's probably going to leave and, look for that challenge elsewhere.
Right. I totally agree. And maybe the compromise is just to not like I'm completely okay with just being called an agilist, or just a scrum master. I am that dedicated role in the scrum guide. Like that's who I am. And maybe my intention isn't to showcase my seniority, because I showcase many skill sets, but I am a dedicated scrum master based on the scrum guide. And that way you have this possibility of becoming something bigger than yourself, right? Because when we try to hire people, we try to hire what they will become versus what they are now, because that's very, very temporary. But I'm going to leave it on that note, on that mic drop, because we will definitely have more episodes around this topic, because this is a very, very important, heavy topic in the Agile space. So I want to thank you, John, for kickstarting us of a series of episodes we're going to have on Agile Interviews.
You're very welcome.
Oh yeah, and you're definitely coming back for those too.
Round 3.
So, round 3. And all you listeners out there, thanks for joining us on today's episode of Agile Interviews. Stay tuned for the next season 1 finale coming soon, Agile Disrupted.